Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. Though I am picking up Dira's clothes, we're actually not going to dive right into an item description this time, since I'll also be taking a brief break from making forward progress, and I wanted to mention why. Drastic changes to the game world are coming, so before any of that happens, I wanted to be sure to check in on various NPCs and see if they had anything new to say. In many cases, they won't, and I'll simply talk over them when that happens. Otherwise, we'll be going over their dialogues as usual, like with this imposter doctor. You were kind of angry last time we spoke, but how are you?
Oh, hello. Still alive, are you? I need more patience. There aren't many humans left, I know, but find me every last one you can. We must find a way to surpass our own stupidity. You're one of the bright ones. Don't you see how much this means? Yes.
Sure. Was that all?
If you find any humans, bring them to me. I'm depending on you, brave hunter.
Yeah, you still seem really untrustworthy, unlike the translation here, which once again I think is generally well done. The first thing I'd like to focus on here is actually related to something I think I've brought up before, but that really highlights the importance of not relying on these sorts of literal translations that I'm using as comparison points. I'm talking about the strictly literal please in Impostor Iosefka's third line of dialogue here, which strikes me as painfully bad. There's a lot being left to implication here, such that a somewhat less literal alternative translation might be, there may not be many people left who aren't beasts at this point, but if there are, you know what to do. In fact, there's a similar line in the Japanese that the official team translates basically that way. If you knock on her door in between sending people to her and claiming your rewards for doing so, Impostor Iosefka will ask, any luck then? Find anyone who hasn't turned? If you do, you know where to send them. The only difference between the Japanese for that line and this one is that the one we haven't seen has the additional word yoroshiku, which is a bit more polite. This lack of politeness, together with the similarity of these lines in the original, probably plays some role in the official translation for the line of dialogue we're looking at here, which is, there aren't many humans left, I know, but find me every last one you can. We've moved beyond simple polite implication here. Instead, she's giving us a polite command. This helps sell the urgency of the moment, emphasizes that she now feels a bit closer to us after we heeded her words upon breaking into the clinic and turning back, and naturally gets across the unspoken expectation. There's so much more going on here than the literal, by now there may be few people who are not beasts, but if there are, please. I find this to be a clear instance of a case where being purely literal loses more in translation than a creative interpretation. And speaking of which, the other point I wanted to briefly address is how in the official translation, Impostor Iosefka ends one of her lines with some praise for the player character. Here my literal translation is simply, I'm counting on you, while the in-game version is, I'm depending on you, brave hunter. And I bring this up because even though it's a relatively small addition, I think it adds a lot of character to this line. You could probably hear some of that difference in my voice even though I'm not a voice actor. But to get back to the original, in Japanese, anata o tayori ni shiteiru wa is almost a stock phrase, but it's noticeably being followed by a string of laughter. Given that, and what we know about this character by now, it's pretty clear she intends to manipulate us as the player character by making us think we're doing good when really we're just furthering her agenda. So I think the idea is that Impostor Iosefka is laying it on a bit thick, and that's exactly what the addition of Brave Hunter does in English as well. Finally, I think there's something to be said for finding a character's voice and writing in it, even when that might involve some deviation from the strictly literal. This is why I've spent some time going into detail on identifying speech characteristics for a number of NPCs that we've talked to. When I mentioned the natural shift in my reading of those two lines earlier, that's because the phrasing of the official version had an implied reading that just fit the character, which is a great indication that a writer or translator has found a good voice for them. But I think that's enough on voices and dialogue for now. Why don't we look instead at that item the lonely old dear gave us so much of earlier? Sedative. Liquid medicine of Bergenworth origin. It has the effect of tranquilizing the spirit. Madness of spirit is a common condition of an investigator of holy mystery, and thick varieties of human blood thankfully tranquilize these disruptions of spirit. That, in time, was the germ that became tied to blood healing. So, there are several things to note here, but the first one I'd like to focus on involves something of a common Japanese way of phrasing things that I've deliberately highlighted in my literal version. You may have noticed that I wrote about tranquilizing the spirit, or madness of spirit, and so on. That's because in Japanese, these phrases are expressed using the term ki, which is something of a vague term in the general usage of the language. Those familiar with Japanese martial arts may recognize this word, as in that context it's often described as the flow of energy or spirit throughout a person's body, or something along those lines. In everyday Japanese, it's a lot less glamorous, even though it can potentially be used to express a whole host of meanings. My Daijisen Japanese dictionary, for instance, has 5 different senses for the word, with 9 separate subsenses for the first sense of the state or working of life, consciousness, the mind, or the heart. Again, though, despite the abstract nature of that definition, it's a term which in practice is often used to express the idea of don't worry about it. Here I have in mind the phrase kini suru, expressed in the negative form of kini shinaide, or something similar. If we wanted to return to the very abstract, we could say that this is an expression meant to express to another person that one should not allow one's consciousness to dwell upon whatever the implied topic is, but that doesn't really reflect the practical usage of the phrase. Daiji-sen's example sentence for kini suru, for instance, would translate to something like, whatever anyone might say, don't let it get to you. So why bring this up in the context of Bloodborne? Well, because I think we're looking at some great examples of phrases that literally might come across as somewhat abstract and pretentious, instead being expressed through natural and appropriate language. It has the effect of tranquilizing the spirit, is instead simply calms the nerves. Madness of spirit is just madness, and perhaps my favorite, disruptions of spirit, has been rendered frayed nerves. These fit both the overarching theme of madness that runs through Bloodborne and the specific context of a sedative meant to calm those whose study brings them closer to insanity. And of course this idea fits in nicely with what we've already seen in things like Madman's Knowledge and Insight, which is that learning the truths of this world may drive one mad. And given that this is the world of Bloodborne, of course the solution would be to drink some nice thick human blood. Which actually brings me to my next point, a bit of extra context on the adjective used to describe the blood used in sedatives. The original Japanese word, no-ko, is actually one I associate most strongly with the flavor of ramen. No-ko miso ramen. In English, we might describe it as having a rich miso flavor, which, when you think of it in the context of drinking human blood, strikes me as extra gross. To be fair, I think thick human blood is reasonably distasteful on its own, but I thought I'd briefly mention that particular association of mine. There's one last thing I'd like to mention about the translation of the description for the sedative, but first, let's see if this note means we're about to get more. Please, be kind enough to wait just a bit, my cute child. As you can see, this is a pretty straightforward message, with a few general features that should be familiar by now. Once again, we're seeing what's literally my cute child being written as dearie, though this time it's in the more elaborate form of my little dearie, perhaps to emphasize that this woman is trying to be as conciliatory as possible. There's also the phrasing of just wait a wee bit, which fits the overall usage of UK English better than my more standard US version of wait just a bit. But the main point I wanted to emphasize with this note is how it can be used to show the continued commitment to varied phrasing in the official translation. Because while we're not going to take this approach to her questline, you can get the old woman to leave Oedon Chapel again to look for more sedatives. In that scenario, she leaves another note on this chair, and in Japanese, there's only one word that's changed. To follow the Japanese, you could just take my literal translation of, please be kind enough to wait just a bit, my cute child, and tack on the word again in the appropriate spot, so you'd get, please be kind enough to wait just a bit again, my cute child. Notably, however, this is not the approach taken by the official translation. Instead, the second note is translated as, wait just a wee bit longer, my little sweet pea. Still pretty similar to, hold on, just wait a wee bit, my little dearie. But the term of endearment has changed. The opening isn't quite the same, and rather than use the word again, we're told to wait a wee bit longer. It's a point I've touched on before, but making an effort to put in this sort of distinction is something that I really think improves the tone of the game in English, where such repetitive phrasing as is used in the Japanese isn't so much the norm, and I thought that was worth highlighting. So having looked at that note, let's turn back to the final line of the sedative, because I think the Japanese here leaves open a possible interpretation that could be of some significance to understanding the history of blood healing in Yharnam. First of all, recall that the general gist of the sedative's description was that while those who studied the arcane have a tendency to go mad, nice, tasty human blood would calm their nerves. Now consider my more literal version of the Japanese here. That, in time, was the germ that became tied to blood healing. Alright, I realize the main point might not be very clear yet, but I think that's in part due to some weird phrasing, so before we go any further, I'd like to first clarify a couple things. First, while the Japanese is using the term hoga, or germ here, it's probably being used to indicate the start of something new, rather than an actual sprout, kind of like the English phrase, the germ of an idea. Second, I think it's reasonably clear that we can take the word that, which opens the line, to mean the practice of drinking human blood to calm the nerves. This brings us to the heart of the matter, which is a fundamental ambiguity in the Japanese based on how we interpret the phrase blood ministration. If we take it as a reference to the founding of the practice, it makes it sound like Lawrence, Bergenworth scholar and founder of the Healing Church, got his idea for blood ministration from his old sedative drinking habits. On the other hand, if we take the tie to blood ministration to mean not the founding of the practice itself, but the start of the habit, it makes it sound like sedatives are the gateway drug for getting people hooked on blood ministration, which of course lines up with the official English. But hold on, let's stop to say hello.
Oh, kind hunter. Another one you sent made it here safe and sound. This place is a real haven now, thanks to you. But I'm afraid that was the last of them. There ain't a peep to be heard, not in the old town. I doubt there's any more out there. God save us. Yharnam's done for.
You sure there's no one left?
There ain't no more survivors. There can't be. Yharnam's done for.
Guess it's a good thing I got all these sedatives. But to briefly finish my point on them, while I think it's important to recognize the ambiguity of the Japanese phrasing in that line, and possibly considering it when putting together the lore of the game, I also think it stands as a great example of how the process of translation inherently involves context and interpretation, because it's a case where the same wording in Japanese can lead to two different, perfectly valid understandings of what's been written. I'm reminded of an example sentence from one of my linguistics classes back in college. If I were to tell you, Liz whacked the tourist with the umbrella, I'm sure you'd form some immediate idea of who's holding the umbrella. But if you think about it, you'll come to realize it's entirely unclear. Did Liz use an umbrella to whack a tourist? Or was it the tourist with the umbrella that Liz decided to whack? The statement itself is ambiguous. You have to interpret it one way or another, and the only way you'll really know what I meant to tell you is if you have additional context. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to a similarly context-dependent bit of nuance that might have gotten lost from the lines of our chapel-dwelling friend. Towards the middle of his initial set of lines here, he literally says, "I haven't heard any human sounds from the streets in a while," which in the official translation is, "There ain't a peep to be heard, not in the whole town." Now, normally this isn't even the sort of difference I'd think to bring up, because the Japanese phrasing for what's essentially, "I haven't heard the sounds of people in town," isn't an especially unusual way of saying, "I haven't heard anyone on the street." But in the context of Bloodborne, where instead of human sounds, there might instead be bestial sounds, I think it's a little more notable that the chapel dweller is saying he hasn't heard any human sounds, as opposed to no sounds at all. You can see something similar in the next line, where the chapel dweller literally says there are no more proper survivors, though in the official text he instead simply says, "There ain't no more survivors." To be fair, this latter example could be a more deliberate choice, since the same phrasing has previously been translated as sane survivors, so this might be a deliberate move to emphasize to the player that the quest line is done. But the end result is that the implication's a little stronger in the Japanese that, while there might still be individuals out there, they've all gone mad or turned to beasts. Having said that, I also think this is probably an example of a situation where a lack of proper context played a role in the resulting translation. Either way, though, that's going to bring us to the end of another episode. So let me encourage you, as always, to leave any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have for me. And until next time, thanks for watching, everyone.